Well, colleagues, dear friends of STIAS, guests to this function, first I've been told that this mic is very sentimental, so I shouldn't move even an inch. So when you see me not moving, it's not because I don't move. But I would like to welcome you most warmly to STIAS, the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study, and to really appreciate Ian, who is our permanent visiting fellow, and Edgar that are going to speak to the launch of Ian's book. A lot more will be said about that in a while. My name is Edward, Professor Edward Chirumira. I'm the director for the STIAS, and also have an additional appointment as a professor extraordinary in the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology at Stellenbosch University. And so when I'm here, because of that posting also, I have to shortly recognize the Rector and Vice Chancellor. So I would like to welcome you all, the fellows, the guests, and all the colleagues and friends that are online, and we really, we do have quite a significant presence online, and we appreciate that as STIAS tries to expand its creative space for the mind to be both physical and virtual in this respect. So welcome to the book launch of Ian Goldin's Rescue from Global Crisis to a Better World. And you've already seen some of the copies in front there. The second book is on its way. Unfortunately, it's not been cleared in good time, but it's on its way, and definitely would appreciate that you can make orders as well. So please feel free to go and pick a copy. But as you know, you pick a copy and drop something. So, but I think it's a good bargain, as we will shortly listen to the conversation around this book. We have the honor to have Professor Wim de Villiers to introduce both panelists this afternoon. Professor de Villiers here is the Rector and Vice Chancellor of Stellenbosch University, and is also a member of the STIAS Board of Directors. So we appreciate that presence on the board and the connection that he will talk to shortly. Professor de Villiers is specialized in gastroenterology and has studied and worked in various capacity in the UK, USA, and of course in South Africa, and is often quoted as a translational scientist who brings advances at the laboratory bench to the patient bedside. So he's highly respected in that regard of translating science to practice, but has also been very key in leaderships of various institutions. So Professor de Villiers is going to introduce both Ian and Edgar this afternoon and set us off in the direction of the presentation. Thank you very much, and Wim, please.
Thank you very much, Edward, and welcome to all of you. So it's always a pleasure to come up to STIAS from my office in Edmund B. It's such a peaceful area to be. You can almost, not that I don't do any thinking in my office, but this does allow for some thinking. And of course, Stellenbosch University is a very significant partner also of the Stellenbosch Institute of Advanced Study. It's very close to our heart. Any conversation with the Vice Chancellor always ends either off with or includes a request for money or a reference to money, and STIAS is funded 50% by Stellenbosch University. and the rest by a very significant contribution by the Wallenberg Foundation in Sweden. So that is a very valuable and valued partnership that we have with the Wallenberg Foundation. And through the Wallenberg Foundation, I think a very nice and a wonderful development has been our partnership with the Nobel Foundation, which for the first time ever outside of Scandinavia will be starting to sponsor some Nobel in Africa symposia. It was already supposed to have started last year or 18 months ago or so, but they've committed to at least a 10-year period, and the first one will take place in October this year with a theme of physics, and a number of Nobel Prize winners have already committed to that. So it's a 5-day-long symposium. Next year it'll be cardiovascular medicine in March, and followed by chemistry and economics, and then we may even get peace involved here as well. So a wonderful partnership that Stellenbosch University has with STIAS, and I think STIAS that's really a jewel in the crown here in town. And it's also a jewel and a wonderful privilege for me to be able to welcome all of you to the public book launch of Rescue, From Global Crisis to a Better World by Ian Goldin. Arianna Huffington calls Rescue essential reading. Former UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown says it is a fresh and penetrating insight from one of the great authorities on globalization. Wim de Villiers says, read it. And Kristalina Georgieva, the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, says, Rescue gives us hope. And I think we can all agree that we live in times now when that is something we are in dire need of. So, for many of you present, Ian Goldin certainly needs no introduction, but I'll give you a quick rundown of his career highlights. Firstly, he's a STIAS Fellow, so it's fitting to host this event here. And he's Professor of Globalisation and Development at the University of Oxford, and a Professorial Fellow at the university's Balliol College. And from 2006 to 2016, he was the founding director of the Oxford Martin School and currently leads the Oxford Martin research programs on technological and economic change, the future of work and the future of development. And I must say, during Ian's current stint at STIAS, I have mercilessly exploited him and had a number of meetings with him and been interacting together with members of my leadership team and just in really finding out everything that he can offer us, and lots of fantastic conversations and insights. So he served as Vice President of the World Bank, and before that he was the Chief Executive of the Development Bank of Southern Africa and an advisor to President Nelson Mandela. He worked as Principal Economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in London and received a knighthood from the French government, and has also been prolific as an author with 23 books and many, many more journal articles from his pen, and that's why we're here today, to discuss his latest publication. So a long list of achievements, but two very important recent achievements is that he completed the Cape Town cycle tour on Sunday, and he wore a Stellenbosch University Marty shirt whilst he was doing that. And the second very major achievement is that he managed to get on top of this platform here without stairs. That was pretty good, even after 109 kilometers in the saddle. So in the introduction to Rescue, Ian makes a few bold statements and he asks some difficult questions. He says, the world will be different after COVID-19. The question is, will it be sufficiently different? And also, the pandemic has provided a unique opportunity to clarify our priorities. And while the idea of radical reform is worrying to many, what I am proposing is far less scary than the prospect of business as usual. So the point of it being that business as usual has indeed gotten society to this very precarious place where we're in at the moment. So I very much look forward to hearing his further insights, and he will be in conversation with Professor Edgar Pieterse, a fellow STIAS Fellow, who is the founding director of the African Centre for Cities, the ACC at the University of Cape Town, and holds the South African Research Chair in Urban Policy. And his research and teaching explore urban development politics, everyday culture, publics, radical social economies, responsive design, and adaptive governance systems. So welcome to both of you, and I really look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rector. And we should add, I'm also a visiting professor at Stellenbosch University. So I've been teaching in your Sustainable Development Master's Program for the last 12 years with Mark Swilling. So, I mean, not that I can fit into a Marty shirt, but, you know, the other credentials are there. Thank you so much for the invitation to be in conversation with Ian. We've only met virtually, what was it, a couple of months ago by Trevor Manuel, a mutual friend. And, but of course, I've been aware of Ian's work for a long time, and I note on your CV you don't list your colored book, which as a young radical student at UWC, of course, was compulsory reading, because within the ANC and the democratic movement, race politics was always a thorny issue and a very difficult thing to discuss. So I do feel I've known Ian for a very, very long time, and as someone who studied, sort of trained in development studies as well, of course, it's been impossible to not engage with his work. So what a privilege to be asked to read Rescue closely, and if you, like me, you know, sort of somehow there's this inverse relationship between being a professor and reading. You'd never read, basically. It's the most bizarre thing. So to have a chance to read a book from cover to cover in these times was absolutely wonderful, and what a read it's been. And I guess my first remark, Ian, is, you know, thank God there are people like you. The rest of us cowered down for the first 18 months of the pandemic. Ian decided, I'm going to make sense of all of this and put it together, put it into this really expansive sort of clinical analysis based on whatever was available data that's around, but also very much propositional. And as I was working through the book over the weekend, I was trying to put my finger on why it felt like such an important intervention. And there's three qualities to it. One is the book, you feel like you're in conversation with Ian. It's very conversational in its tone, but that's just to seduce you into the analysis, because actually it is underpinned by really, really vast amounts of empirical data so that we can begin to decipher some of the trends. Secondly, the book is both grounded, it's realist, but it's also hopeful, as Wim has already indicated. And it is trying to help us understand what are the unprecedented opportunities to act decisively so that we can begin to address so many of the many issues that have bedeviled the global economy, that is confounding us in terms of the future of the worlds of work, the differential impacts of technology, the barbarization of politics, the significance of attending to mental health questions, especially at a societal scale, and rethinking where we live, where we work, how we learn, and how do we move around in the places where we live, i.e. cities. And all of this to come to terms, to recognize that we also have to come to terms with the bigger existential threat of climate change and biodiversity loss. What a wide-ranging analysis. But the third part, which I've already intimated, is that it's not just that it's diagnostic, it's not just that it is indicative, but it is decidedly propositional. Ian is putting forward a whole bunch of very specific claims about what a radical reform or radical transformative politics could look like. And what I appreciated about it is that it's not just that he sets that out, but he actually builds a rubric for accountability. He indicates that these are the differential responsibilities of different stakeholders and actors with power in our society to move this agenda forward. And I think that that's really superb. Now, I'm aware that I'm one of the lucky few, the chosen few who've had access to the book. Most of you have not. So, Ian, if I may ask you to sort of kick us off, to maybe share with us, when the rest of us were cowering in our basements, why you felt the urge to write this book, and how would you summarize the main takeaways before we get into some of the substantive themes in the book?
Thank you so much, Edgar, for agreeing to do this discussion, for reading the book so carefully, and for summarizing it in a way which I think is much more effective than I could do. But let me try. But before doing so, I do want to also pay tribute to the Rector and Vice-Chancellor, Wim de Villiers. He also did the 109 kilometers in what the English would call character-building weather. And so congratulations to you, and also for the warmth in which you've embraced me in Stellenbosch, and particularly to the director, Edward Kurumari, who really has taken over the reins of STIAS, and I think taking it to a next level. This is the most amazing place and privilege to be at, and it really has been, for me, a fantastic third visit. I'm very sorry I'm leaving in about 10 days' time, but I hope to be back. And it's an extraordinary thing, STIAS. It really is a jewel that needs to be treasured and nurtured over time. And thanks too to all Christophe, Nelmarie, and others that have organized this event, which is a fantastic opportunity to engage with my fellow fellows and others. So why did I write this book, and what are the main messages? The first thing I had to do when the pandemic struck was finish another book, which is the book that's stuck, Terra Incognita, which is the one that's stuck in customs, which is this very big, fat book, which is basically identifying the key trends that are going to define our future with maps and infographics and visualizations. And I managed to get that out of the way, and then the question was, what do you make sense of this? And in what way do these trends that I had spent the previous 2 years working on get affected by this devastating pandemic? I had also written in 2013 a book called The Butterfly Defect, Why Globalization Creates Systemic Risks and What to Do About It, in which I predicted the pandemic and said that this was inevitably going to be the next global crisis of major proportions. And I've been banging on about it since then. And again, in a whole lot of other ways, in my BBC series, in a book called Age of Discovery, where I compare our time to the Renaissance, I argued the same thing, that this hyperconnectivity, which has been the source of progress, of unprecedented magnitudes, reductions in poverty, improvements in life expectancy, increases in information, the liberation of people from a history of servitude, mentally and physically around the world, was also the source of our undoing, unless we manage it more effectively. And it's that sense, which I'd been working on for probably 10 years by the pandemic struck, of the need to do things very differently, that was my primary motivation in writing the book. The feeling, not so much that I told you it would happen, but that this has to be the wake-up call that leads us out of this, what I fear would be a rather dystopian future, unless we grapple with the underbelly of what some would call globalization, which is flows across national borders of goods, of people, of ideas, of data, of everything, and of course, of germs, of bacteria, of viruses. It's that hyperconnectivity, which is both the liberation, it's the reason South Africa is free and we're here today. It would not have happened if the Berlin Wall had not come down, if there hadn't been sanctions, if there hadn't been an international support for the ANC, etc., etc. We wouldn't be here. One has to recognize that this is the most progressive force in the history of humanity. That's why I worry about people that want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say globalization is the source of the pandemic. It's the source of climate change, because too many people are climbing the energy curve. Let's stop it. That would be to put us back, and jumping ahead to what Russia's trying to do with Ukraine. We have to be able to manage this. We have to be able to understand it in order to manage it. And what the book is about is part analysis of where COVID has had an impact on multiple dimensions, and there's not a dimension of our lives that it hasn't had. So I talk about incomes and inequality, employment. I talk about the future of work and remote work, therefore the future of cities, the future of offices. I talk about mental health, as you mentioned. I talk about the future of businesses, of climate change, and crucially, of how we stop the next pandemic. And it's that trying to weave together in a way that is accessible those arguments that gives us this book. I've written, as you mentioned, 23 books. I think I've had real impact with many of them, and I try to do this one in a different way for two reasons. One is I did it almost totally alone, sitting at home. Most of my other books, I had research assistants, I had libraries, I had lots of other things to do. This was basically done by me surfing the web at home alone. So that made it different in the research methodology. But I also wanted to be different in the sense of appealing to a wider audience, not an academic book. And if any of you find anything in the book that's jargon or that you can't read, come and tell me so that the next edition I can take it out. I wanted a book that would make sense to readers. I wanted a book to be hopeful because I am hopeful. I think we're in the best place in human history in trajectory. Of course, Ukraine is disastrous, the pandemic is disastrous, but in the long sweep of history, we're in a much better place than we were before, not least in South Africa, but in many places. People, I felt, haven't appreciated that. That means we've got much more to lose. And it's that loss. In terms of the main arguments, my biggest concern is the language I was hearing of bouncing back, bouncing forward. This, which we now see more intensely because we're also relieved the pandemic is over. That's what worried me most, because that implies we go back onto the tracks that are leading us over a precipice. That inevitably means we will have more pandemics, we will have escalating climate change, growing inequality, and all the negatives that are associated with globalization. The other language, like a reset, which is the World Economic Forum's language, also worries me. When we reset our computers, we go back to the operating systems they were. That's a disaster. So we need to do something different, and the book is basically a manifesto for what that is. It also draws a lot on history, not least the Second World War.
Yeah.
Crises are best avoided. They are horrible times. People suffer desperately, and we all know people who have suffered desperately because of the pandemic. And when we turn on our TV screens, we see the horrors of what's happening in Ukraine. But crises, if they lead to a better world, might be worth the suffering that is endured. If they don't, then that is the real tragedy. And that's what happened with the financial crisis. I wrote a lot about it. I don't think that we did the structural reforms necessary. I don't think it was the wake-up call it should have been. And that means we will inevitably have another financial crisis. The same thing's happening on climate change. We see crises all around. We're not doing enough fast enough. If the pandemic and now the war in Ukraine can be that wake-up call, the deaths and the suffering will not have been in vain.
Thanks, Ian. And so just to say that I thought the historical perspective was really helpful, I think, to contextualize, and that device and sort of structures of the argument worked really well. But I am curious, I think you must have finished the book sort of 1 year into the pandemic. There's been so much flux and change in the last year as societies have adapted at various speeds. We've also seen a repetition of the differential access to vaccines, the continuation of the sort of the inequalities around that and the effects of that, of course. And that was all before Putin's latest adventure. So I'm curious, if when you do the second edition, if you've got to start putting that together tomorrow, are there things in that sort of overall argument that are there things you'll emphasize differently? Or are there things with the benefit of hindsight that you think you might have gotten wrong, or that that you would sort of develop in another way in the book? I'm just curious what your reflections are.
Yeah, I ask myself that a lot. This paperback, which is the book that's on sale here, was only printed in January. So the publishers gave me the opportunity.
Okay.
In December, they called me and said, normally there's a year between a hardback and a paperback. This time it was only 5 months. And they said, is there anything you want to change for the paperback? So I went through the book. And they also have another condition, is whatever you do, don't change the pagination. Because then we have to do another index, and we don't want to do that. So I went through the book, and I discussed it with the publishers, and I decided there was nothing. Material that had changed. Of course, there's new data, the numbers are different, etc. But there's nothing immaterial in the book on the pandemic, and that remains the case, that I feel I got wrong or I'd want to change. The big new information is, of course, Ukraine and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I would want to say something about that because it's on people's minds and they want to know how it affects what I'm saying. But I don't think it changes the basic narrative. I think it reinforces it. It's a war that arises out of a failure to recognize business as usual is going to lead to disaster. Business as usual with Russia. People have been saying this. My friend Gary Kasparov has been screaming about this. I hosted a book event that he did in Oxford on exactly this. It's that which I feel the book's about and which Ukraine reinforces. And of course, as soon as one starts writing about this war, firstly, I don't know what the sound is. Firstly, this war's, I think, going to run a long time, so it'll always be unfinished if I was writing now. And secondly, it's not me that's making that noise, is it? No. And secondly, it's such a big topic that it would be a book in itself. So, yes and no is the answer. But I hope that readers, when they read the book, it's a little bit more difficult to be optimistic now than it would have been if people felt, okay, the pandemic's over, now I can focus on the future. But I think it reinforces rather than undermines the messages.
So Ian, of course, given where we are in Stellenbosch on the African continent, I think the few questions I'll pose to you will mainly be to try and tease out what sense we can make of the impact of the pandemic and the possibilities from this perspective. Just to say that I'll pose a few more questions to Ian, and then we'll leave the last 20 minutes or so open for questions from the floor. So of course, when I read the data, one of the curiosities about the impact of COVID has been the relatively benign public health impacts in many African countries, despite the absence of vaccines, of sort of protective measures, of capacity within the public health systems, and very short lockdowns, because of course that was economically simply unviable because most people are in the informal economy and live on a day-to-day existence. So I am curious, and that does seem in terms of the trends in the other world regions to be somewhat anomalous. What your reflections are of that and what sense we can make of that and what some of the policy implications for Africa might be.
Yeah, I'm not convinced by the argument that the pandemic has been more benign in Africa. If you look at the excess death numbers, for what one could call a P statistic, comparing excess mortality over normal mortality rates across countries, that statistic is no better for African countries that have any sort of credible data on excess deaths than the excess death data for the advanced economies. Now, others, including the rector, are far better qualified to comment on health matters than I am. But I'm not convinced that the low mortality rates we're seeing in some of the published data reflect the real fact. It's not, excess deaths, of course, not only COVID-19 direct. It's the crippling of health services. It's the failure to get out the malaria bed nets. It's lots of second-order ramifications that come from COVID-19. But that's also true in the UK and in other countries. In the UK, we have a waiting list now of 5 million operations because of COVID-19. So it's not just that COVID-19 is killing people. It's that they're dying of cancer or they're dying of a heart or any other things that would have been treated without it. That's simply looking at the health. Then you look at the non-health or directly health things, and you look at the second-order implications on inequality, on poverty, on nutrition. The World Bank's estimating that 140 million more people have been pushed into dire poverty that's living under $1.90 a day by the pandemic. The World Food Programme is estimating 160 million more people are suffering acute malnutrition. And that's before the food price hikes we're about to see coming through the system because of Ukraine. And then you think about the mortality and and you think of all sorts of second-order implications in terms of girls' education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, I don't buy the argument that Africa's been less affected. I actually think it's been much more affected than the advanced economies, and that's because the governments don't have the capacity to help. There's been no $20 trillion rollout of fiscal and monetary stimulus. In other words, bankrolling societies, which the rich countries, the OECD countries have found. $20 trillion. That is 8 times the total size of the African economy, just in support for the citizens of the rich countries. Workers being paid not to go to work, furlough schemes and so on. Businesses being closed, paid not to close down. Free rollout of testing kits, everything. I mean, this is the biggest government intervention ever in history. That is not happening in the poor countries and in the middle-income countries. They just cannot afford it. Which means the longer-term growth implications are going to be much more severe in low and middle-income countries. So my reflection is that this has caused the biggest development disaster in certainly my lifetime, probably ever in history. It has reversed development at a greater pace than ever in history. It has derailed the SDGs, and that's what the consciousness should be about, not that Africa's got off lightly.
Thanks, that's really helpful, and it connects very much to the next point. So some of the proposals you put forward, sort of as clearly centers around a much more interventionist role for government. So you refer to wealth taxes, you refer to much more ambitious debt relief, solidarity-driven rescue packages, stronger and bigger safety nets, mass reskilling, retraining of workers in redundant occupations. You're talking about the importance of supporting the transition away from extractive to sustainable economies on the back of technological innovation and so forth. At the same time, you do recognize that these are very difficult things for governments with a very bad credit track record to do because they've got to keep in mind creditworthiness and considerations of investors and so forth. We know we've got at least 25 LDCs still in Africa. We've got probably another 20 lower middle income countries. So the norm is highly restricted sort of tax bases and fiscal frameworks. Now, at some point in the book, you suggest that there might be some kind of solidarity component to the rescue packages, to the $20 trillion you're talking about. But you don't sort of really elaborate that. And I was curious, how do African governments, what is the call to action you're putting to African governments given this constraint? And how should we rethink, or how should we think in more concrete terms about what this means for the Common African Market, for Agenda 2063, and so forth. So if you could maybe just elaborate a little bit how the analysis lands within the African context.
Yeah. Well, I think, amongst the many problems that need to be resolved is the total collapse of solidarity globally. We see it in vaccination rates. 14% of low and middle income countries have been double vaccinated, compared to now approaching 80% of high income countries. And by the way, South Africa is very poor in this regard as well, about 30% double vaccination, same as Egypt more or less. But some countries, Nigeria, less than 10%. Okay, it's both the supply, the failure of COVAX and everything, but it's also a demand issue. So the one thing we need to sort out for future is African capability to manufacture and distribute, cold store, etc., vaccines. That is a massive failure. It took far too long. And I think the fact that if it was African, there would also be more public acceptance. I think there's a lot of what we're seeing is sort of partly related to uncertainties regarding trials that have been conducted elsewhere, etc. There's been a second massive failure has been on the financial front. While the rich countries have found $20 trillion for themselves, less than 100 billion, so a tiny fraction of 1%, have been found for development. This is in sharp contrast to even the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, when George W. Bush and then Gordon Brown called meetings, and there were very large mobilizations. About 10% of what the rich countries found for themselves, they sent. So this is less than 100th of that response. One can ask the question why, but that the G20, the G7, whatever Gs there are, have failed completely in this. Why, at a time when Africa has never needed it more, has there been this collapse? And the UK government, for example, has cut aid by 1/3 at this time, when it's never been more needed, which is extraordinary that they got away with it politically. I'm not saying it's a surprise from this government, but I'm saying that they felt they could do it politically, I think is an indictment of where Britain is at the moment. So we need a massive mobilization of aid. And it'll be even bigger because of what's coming out of Ukraine. The third thing we need is, and you alluded to this, is a debt restructuring. Countries have reached the limits of their fiscal capacity. In other words, they've taken on as much debt as they can to deal with the consequences of COVID-19. South Africa trying to give a basic income grant to people even on a temporary basis, putting up temporary hospitals, etc., etc. And this is across all low and middle income countries, not only in Africa, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Latin American, and others too. But that means there's no more space to invest in the future. There's no more space for education, for health, for infrastructure, for all the other things that you need for development. That can only be resolved, and now interest rates are about to go up, by the way, and the dollar is going to strengthen relative to emerging market countries, which is going to make this even more difficult to repay. The only solution is a debt restructuring. The IMF estimates 36 countries are very close to debt default, including some very close by here, like Zambia. The only solution is a restructuring of debt. That can be done. It's been done before. I was involved in the previous debt restructuring negotiations. It's complicated, but it can be done if there's the political will. It all comes down, in the end, to the political will. Not only here and our ability to mobilize from South Africa and elsewhere, but also, is Biden prepared to do this? Is Johnson? Is Macron? Is the new chancellor in Germany, etc.? That's what it comes down to. While they are fighting Russia and trying to have a Cold War with China. Can they juggle 3 balls? Or will this ball, the development ball, fall? And that's what we have to guard against.
So there are many sort of questions that I want to still get to, and I'm going to just do one more because there's a whole chapter on cities. As I was, sort of very pleased about that, as you can imagine. But I'll just not ask the others because we're running low on time, and then I'll collect 3 questions at a time, and then Ian, you can respond to those. But so the one, so in the chapter on cities, Ian connects a number of dots in terms of working from home and the changing cultures and work patterns around that, how property markets on the commercial side have been restructured, and how different mobility patterns emerge as a result of that, all pointing to the fact that we can achieve much greater productivity and we can optimize space and land markets and so forth if we really imagine a different work-life balance and we really put well-being at the center of rethinking the future of cities and how we live and so on. All fantastic. And then there's this one, and I have to pull out this quote because it tickled me. He then sort of points to one of the problems being these large property empires, quote unquote. So the idea that we've got to unbundle the existing sort of real estate machines is obviously, I can't agree with you more. It's a really tantalizing prospect, but in many, many cities, this is precisely what oils the political machine. And of course, we know a lot of city governments also depend on those investments in terms of their local tax bases. So, yeah, could you just sort of say a little bit more about how we could concretize that? And I understand your reference point, the data you were drawing on was in the UK and some of the American cities. But yeah, I'd love to sort of hear a bit more about how we can imagine the dismantling of large property empires. And then I'll open to the floor.
Okay. When our mutual friend, Trevor Manuel, who I respect enormously, and for those of you that are not from South Africa, he was the former finance minister, amongst many other things. But when he introduced us, he said, because my next book is related to this question, he said, speak to Edgar. He knows everything you need to know. And now you're asking me the question. And I completely agree with Trevor's judgment. So, it's quite rich you asking me this question. But the first thing to say is that cities are the lifeblood of our future. There's nothing that we can think about, whether it's resolving pandemics, climate change, or anything else, that is not going to be played through the city space. And cities are going to be both the solution and the problem space. Yeah. People are going to die of starvation, or they're going to solve the problems in the city. So how we think about the viability of cities really, really matters, which is why I want to work on my next book on this topic. Some cities, the idea that people basically flee cities, the rich flee cities, and go and work remotely, threatens fundamentally the viability of cities. I don't think it'll happen for various reasons. It'll also, basically, by the way, destroy productivity and creativity. There's no accident that we have Silicon Valley in Silicon Valley, or Wall Street in Wall Street, or whatever else. It's the coming together of people that changes the world, not the dispersal. We can debate that long and hard. I mean, there are different views, of course, on this matter. My worry is that the public transport systems of the major cities are now facing bankruptcy, and we can enter a death spiral as a result of that. So that's sort of a big issue. But property markets are related to this. Obviously, the valuations are changing in quite fundamental ways. The people that control supply and demand, and I don't know enough about South Africa to be able to comment on South Africa. You are the expert genuinely on this, but I can speak to what's happening in the UK, in some of the US markets, in Spain. You have some investors, including some big financial firms, who now have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of properties on their balance sheet. They control the feed in and out, and prices, rentals, sale prices. When you have that situation, you have a very dangerous situation. Firstly, the viability of these firms, and we're seeing this in China at the moment, yep, with the crash in the Chinese property market. And this has systemic implications for the financial system, as well as many others, for the affordability of property and so on. But it's so opaque that we don't actually know what's going on half the time. So the first thing I would say is, what is going on?
Yeah.
You know, people should have an onus not on reporting that some trust owns a property in some offshore tax haven or even onshore, in some nominees' names, but we actually want to know who owns this in terms of the ultimate control. Then we want to know, what are they doing with this? And I do think there's a case for competition policy, for planning permission policies and others to have access to this data and to act on it. I don't think that it's a magic solution to say break up these major things and you're suddenly going to resolve housing crises or anything. No, it's much more complicated, but it's one piece which you picked up on very astutely of a much bigger puzzle that needs to be resolved.
Thanks, Ian. So there's a roving mic, so if you can just put up your hand if you want to ask a question or make a brief comment. The floor is open. I've got a blue shirt in the middle. So I'm happy to collect 2 or 3 and then Ian can respond. If you don't mind introducing yourself, please, before you ask your question.
Albert Grinling. I'm a historian, or former historian probably. Therefore, a boring historical question. I noticed in the burp in the book you refer to the Beveridge Report in 1942. Now, conceptually, I'd like some clarification on that, as it did lay the foundation for the development of the British welfare state and etc. But that was in 1942. And it was obviously accelerated as a result of the Second World War, but its roots went far deeper or far further back into history. Now, I'd just like some clarification on that and the epidemic, because these two things were quite different in some ways. It was a crisis which evoked different kind of responses. Perhaps if you can elaborate on that a bit. Thank you.
Thanks. Ian, do you want to take that? And then
Do you want to click 3? Up to you.
Well, there isn't another hand as
Okay,
yet.
great.
So, there's one at the back, sorry. Just right down there.
Yeah, thanks for that analysis, and I think I can follow your suggestion that reconstruction on a global scale is necessary in order to counteract all those destructive developments. And I'm also with you when you say business as usual is not possible anymore. But do you have any imagination how to convince or to urge those who profit of that business as usual, or what means could be taken in order to get pressure or to convince those who have the power? So I think the question of power relation is very difficult to resolve, and maybe you don't have a recipe for that, but I didn't hear enough in order to have an impression of how you could solve this question, or how big you think that this problem would just also hinder the reconstruction of the world. Thank you.
Do you mind introducing yourself, please? Sorry.
Oh yeah, Wolfram Walser, I'm fellow here at STIAS. I'm also very much enjoying the exchange that we have here.
Excellent. Ian, why don't we... okay. Sorry, let's do the... I've got 2 hands, so let's Ian answer those 2, and then we'll take those 2 hands. Great.
What's the connection between the Beveridge Report of 42 and the COVID-19 pandemic of 20?
Don't say anything. Buy the book. It's beautifully explained in the book.
The Beveridge Report was a response to decades and decades of failure. It was part of, and the reason I cite it, it was part of a recognition in the midst of the horrors of the Second World War, 42. Bombs were dropping on the buildings in which Beveridge was writing his report. It was part of a recognition that business as usual would not resolve the permanence of the war. H.G. Wells had said in 1919 this would be the war to end all wars. The people that were living through the horrors of the Second World War, which was bigger and more fearful in magnitude, including Churchill and Roosevelt, remembered the war. They also remembered the Great Depression, the failures of the system. They also, incidentally, remembered the Roaring Twenties. And my fear is that we're going to go into Roaring Twenties again. I think Ukraine has stopped that one. But that was where I thought we would be before Ukraine. And they recognized in different ways the need for radical change. Now, Beveridge, like Keynes, were academics. They were drawn on by government. And Beveridge was also a minister in the government for some time. So was Keynes, for that matter. They were drawn on by the government to provide the intellectual foundations for a new world order. Beveridge, welfare state, overcoming the 5 wants. It was also absolutely necessary to satisfy the population. People were going off to die. In my college, Balliol, 20% of the class died. You had to say to the parents and to the population, we will not let this happen again. Your death of your children is not in vain. And you had to do it in a credible way. And that's what happened. That's why they created the welfare state. That's why they created the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and others, the Marshall Plan. They were born of a necessity to change the world, a radical change, and they were radical. Beveridge was radical. Now, it's very interesting that he was too radical for Churchill. So Churchill would not embrace this idea of full employment, free health service, free education, which was at free housing, that was at the heart of the Beveridge Report, overcoming the 5 wants, as Beveridge called it. What happened? Within 6 weeks of the war ending, and you can imagine what a war hero Churchill was at that point, delivering the UK from certain destruction. We'd all be speaking, I would be speaking, well, I would be dead, but my family would have been killed, but speaking German. Within 6 weeks, Churchill was deposed in the biggest landslide victory that Labour has ever seen in the UK by an unknown figure, Clem Attlee. Okay, because he would not embrace the Beveridge Report. The relevance for today is that's where I believe we are as a possibility in history. That this pandemic has been of an equivalent nature of a war, and now it's been compounded by the Ukraine situation, the war that Russia's engaged in on Ukraine. And that's the appetite for change is there. And when you look at the opinion polls, and it's all in the book, you see this appetite for change. 92%, 90%, 87%, 85% of people saying, let's not go back to business as usual. That's the relevance of Beveridge. On power and whether we really can change. Yes, a lot of people have done extremely well out of business as usual. And they are finding now that they found in the pandemic that business as usual had to stop. And now they're finding that their business as usual with Russia has to stop also. That building a power relationship or a business based on unstable foundation, reconstruction, as you said, based on unstable foundations means it's going to crumble. Only question is when and how. And that's where we got to. So, of course, power is intrinsic to this. Of course, a lot of people don't want to change, and a lot of people are making a lot of money out of the old power relationships and everything else. Yes, that's why we still have what we have. But, as happened in the UK in 1945, as happened in the US during the war, as has happened in Europe now on Ukraine, coming together, as has happened in Poland with them accepting 1.7 million refugees when they wouldn't even accept 10,000 before the war. People changed their mind. and power relations change very quickly in times of crises. If you don't seize the opportunity of the crisis, you lose the moment in history. Then you go back to complacency, then you get back, the old power relations have to reestablish themselves, and you've lost that opportunity. That's what happened after the financial crisis. That's why I wrote the book. You have to use these moments to change. If you don't, well, then you are condemned by history to just repeat the failures of the past.
Thanks, Ian. I've got a question there, and then one in the corner, and then a final one there.
Yes, I'm a fellow at STIAS from the University of Bonn in Germany, and I worked on transformation of agriculture here, and we put out on that also by STIAS. And now I'm working in complexity in agriculture and food systems. And if we realize that we have a large amount of hunger here in Africa, we have land grabbing, agricultural land by countries outside Africa. We have the food grabbing by European countries who are buying food and moving it to feed their cattle in Germany. And now you have the pandemic and people moving into the cities. With all the things you said about the dollar going up, the energy crisis, do you cover this in your book? The solution to food security in Africa where people are unsure of themselves, are moving to big cities where yields are extremely low. They're 1/10 of what they are in Europe and in the United States. It's an extremely strong time bomb that's going to be hitting us in the future.
Thank you. I've got a question in the corner.
Knut Lustad, also as a fellow at STIAS. I'm afraid to get the same question over and over again. Let me try another time. I was going to ask when I heard you speak. You talk very convincingly and optimistically about what needs to change. And you also answered what those kind of processes need to be. But I was wanting to ask you, what kind of movements or actors do you see happening today that could be the starting point of such a process? If you know what I mean, rather than starting from the necessity of change. And if you want to locate it in material processes or actors, where do you see those embryonic form of that change happening?
Great, thank you. And one final question in the middle.
Environmental education. I'd like to get your view on the resolving of the crisis, the opportunities by cities. As you said, people are moving to cities. But major tree planting projects in cities, especially fruit trees, not only in cities but also in rural areas. Because the pandemic showed us we need healthy food, vitamins. Just want to get your view on that. It is possible. It's already started. It is possible.
Thanks. I'm going to sneak in one more. There was a lady behind. Yes, if she just, yeah, and then we'll end.
I'll do a book signing afterwards and then I can talk to people also. If you can just say.
I would like you to write a sequel gathering data, realistic data now, to see if countries really followed out with the proposals or suggestions you are making in this book in terms of taking advantage of the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you. So we are pretty much at the end of the allocated time, so I'm going to ask Ian to be as pithy as possible. But the good news is there are books to be purchased, books to be signed, and Ian is available to be harassed. So feel free to spend some time afterwards to do that, but I'll just ask you to round up these questions, and then I'll ask Christoph to close us off for this afternoon.
Thanks so much, Edgar, and let me take this opportunity to thank you for your wonderful discussion with me. Let me take the food security and tree planting question together. I'm not a food security expert. I know a lot of people, including, incidentally, my successor as the director of the Oxford Martin School. He's a food systems person, Charles Godfrey. And I would agree that it's a crucial integrated issue into so many other debates, including debates around cities, debates around climate change, water, resources, supply chains, and everything. I mean, what's happening with the Russian invasion of Ukraine is devastating for food systems, partly because Russia is such a big exporter of fertilizers, and of course both of them of grains. So this will impact severely, and I think it will compound the malnutrition and other issues. So all I can do is salute people that work on this issue and try to come up with solutions, and the same applies to tree planting. I don't know much about that, but it sounds like a very good idea to me, so good luck to you with that initiative. On the question of movements for change, one of the wonderful aspects of globalization, one of the wonderful positive aspects of social media, although there are many negative aspects, has been this ability to ignite global movements of change through one tweet. You know, the Me Too movement, for example. One person sending a tweet has made things impossible to do in boardrooms or in events and things, and I can give you lots of instances where I've seen this from one individual actor. Someone standing with a protest placard, Greta Thunberg, creating a worldwide movement. Just one young schoolgirl creating a global movement. Attitudes have changed fundamentally as well. You know, when I was growing up, you couldn't come out in South Africa as being gay. Now there are 42 countries, including South Africa, I'm proud to say, which has recognized gay marriage. The Prime Minister of Ireland was gay. And when I said to my Irish friends, this is remarkable, they sort of looked at me as if I was from the Stone Ages and said, it's just normal. Why do you say it's remarkable? That's how quickly attitudes can change. And we're seeing it all the time. The movements can be catalyzed by individuals, they can be catalyzed by groups like Extinction Rebellion and many, many others. And they, hopefully, can be nurtured, supported, challenged by people like me who write books. You can't claim too much, you know? And this goes to the final question on the sequel. I don't imagine I'm ever going to get a government to change its policies, certainly not alone, maybe working with other institutions, being part of a process. These processes of change are extremely complex, dynamic, but they do move all the time and fast. And if you can be part of that and move it in the direction that you feel more comfortable with, that's good. I hope that when the history of this period of time is written in generations to come, they will look back on this period like we look back at the Second World War and say, something happened to change the course of history. Like they look back on the late 80s and early 90s, whether it's in China, whether it's in Europe or elsewhere, and certainly in South Africa, and say that was a period where our views changed and history changed. That's what we have to hope for, and that's what we have to work for.
Thanks, Ian. Crystal.
Thank you so much, Edgar. Thank you, Ian. So I have nothing else to add except to say we hope some of those movements start right here, Ian. So I have only a very a short task, and that is to thank a number of people. So Protea Bookstore, who brought copies of the rescue book. You can buy them, but you'll have to rush because they might run out of copies, in which case you can place an order. You can also place orders for Terra Incognita, and then as Ian mentioned and Edgar mentioned, he's happy to be put down for some signatures. To Professor de Villiers, thank you very much for your word at the start in introducing Edgar and Ian, and to all the audience members, thank you, and in return we like to welcome you to a reception and something to drink. Thanks again, Edgar and Ian.